I will make videos and read at the same time in order to help me read. This book is called The Law of War and Peace by Grotius. Preface. Number 1. Many have undertaken to expound or to summarize in commentaries or abridgments the civil law of Rome or of their own states. But few have treated of that law that exists between peoples or between the rulers of peoples, whether based upon nature or established by divine decree, or grown out of custom and tacit agreements. And no one, as yet, has discussed it in a comprehensive and systematic way. Important as it is to mankind that this should be done. 3. The work is all the more necessary because in our own time, as in the past, there is no lack of men who make light of this branch of the law, as if it were nothing but an empty name. On most men's lips are the words of Euphemus, quoted by Thucydides, that for a king or a free city nothing is wrong, that is in their interest, that is their advantage, that is to their advantage. To this may be added a similar saying, that for fortune's favorites might makes right. Fortune's favorites might makes right. Also, that a state cannot be run without some injustice. Moreover, the disputes that arise between nations or kings are in fact usually decided by Mars. And it is not only the ignorant who believe that war has nothing whatever to do with law, but men who are learned and wise often let fall remarks that support such an opinion. Nothing is more common than a contrast drawn between law and arms. 5. But since it would be futile to discuss this kind of law, if actually it does not exist, it is incumbent on us to endorse and defend our work by refuting briefly this most serious error. So to save us from having to deal with a swarm of opponents, let us appoint one speaker for them all. And whom better could we choose than Carneades, who became so skillful in what his school considered the supreme art that he could muster the full power of his eloquence as easily to defend a falsehood as to defend a truth. He once undertook an attack on justice in particular, that type of justice of which we are now speaking, and used this as his strongest argument, that laws were imposed by men on themselves in their own interest. Voluntary. Varying as customs varied, and often altered by the same people as the times changed, that, accordingly, there was no such thing as a law of nature, seeing that all creatures, men as well as other animals, were inspired by nature to work only for their own advantage, and that, therefore, there was no justice, or, if there were any, it was the height of folly, because a man who considered other men's welfare was only doing himself an injury. 6. But certainly, we must not accept what that philosopher says, or the poet who follows him. And nature cannot tell what's just from what's unjust. For though man is indeed an animal, he is an extraordinary animal, differing far more from all other animals than they differ in kind from each other. To this fact bear witness the many traits peculiar to the human species. Among these traits, peculiar to man, is his desire for society, that is, for life in a community. Not any sort of life, but one that is peaceful and organized to suit the measure of his intelligence, with persons of his own kind. The Stoics called this trait friendliness. Therefore, we should not grant as a universal proposition the statement that nature impels every animal to aim only at his own advantage. 7. There are other animals, too, that in one way or another restrain their desires for their own comfort for the sake, sometimes of their offspring, and sometimes of their fellow creatures. Such conduct, on their part, springs, we believe, from the extrinsic intelligent principle, because when it comes to other acts, no more difficult than those, they do not show the same degree of understanding. The same may be said of children, for even before their training begins, they display an inclination to do good to others, as Plutarch acutely observed. Thus, even at that early age, they break out spontaneously into pity. The man of mature years, as a part of his intense desire for society, has knowledge that makes him act in a similar way under similar circumstances. He also, alone among animals, has the special instrument of speech and the faculty of understanding and conducting himself in accordance with general rules. What belongs to that faculty is not common to all animals, but peculiar to humankind. 8. This care to preserve society, which we have here roughly outlined, and which is characteristic of human intelligence, is the source of all law, which is properly so called. From it come the rules that we must not take something belonging to another, must restore whatever we have that is another's with the profit we made from it. We must restore whatever we have that is another's with the profit we made from it. Trusts, we have private trusts and we own them once you claim them. We must restore whatever we have that is another's with the profit we made all proceeds from. I hereby all proceeds from must keep our promises and must take good a loss incurred through our fault, and also that it is right to punish men who deserve it. 9. Out of this meaning of law arises another and broader one. For man, above all other animals, possesses not only the strong social faculty of which we have spoken, but also the judgment to weigh his joys and pains, both present and future, and whatever conduces to both. Evidently, then, it is part of human nature, as far as the capacity of the human mind allows, to follow in these matters well-framed judgments, and not be led astray by fear or temptation of present pleasure, or be carried off by reckless impulse. Whatever we do that is plainly contrary to good judgment is contrary also to the law of nature, that is to say, of the nature of man. 11. And what we have just said would have validity even if we granted what cannot be granted without great wickedness, that there is no God, or that he has no care for human affairs. But the opposite belief has been instilled in us, partially by our reason, partly by an unbroken tradition, confirmed by many proofs and miracles attested through every age. It follows that we should, without exception, obey God as our Creator, to whom we owe ourselves and all that we have, especially since he has shown himself in many ways most good and most mighty. Thus, being himself eternal, he is able to offer to those who obey him the greatest rewards, even those who are eternal. And we must believe he has willed to do so, all the more since he has explicitly promised it, as we Christians, who are convinced by the undoubted faithfulness of the testimonies, do believe. 12. Here, then, is another source of law, besides the source in nature, namely, the free will of God, to which, as our intellect irresistibly tells us, we must submit. Moreover, the law of nature, of which we have spoken, both that which relates to man in society and that which may be taken in a broader sense, although it springs from man's inner fundamental traits, may rightfully be ascribed to God, for the reason that he willed we should have such traits. 13. Furthermore, through the laws he has given us, God has made these traits still more clear, even to persons whose minds have feeble powers of reasoning, for he has forbidden us to yield to distracting passions that would harm either ourselves or others, effectually checking our more violent impulses and controlling them within bounds and limits. 14. Sacred history also, besides the commands it contains, does much to strengthen man's social instinct, since it teaches that we all are children of the same first parents. In that sense, we may rightly repeat what Florentinus has said in another connection, namely, that nature has made us all kindred of one another, and consequently, that it is wrong for man to plot against man. To men, their parents are indeed like divinities, to whom they owe obedience, not unlimited, but yet of a special kind. 15. Now the law of nature requires us to abide by our promises, since it is necessary that men should have some way of binding themselves to one another, and no other natural way can be imagined. And this was the origin of civil laws, for all who had joined a group or had submitted themselves to some other man or men had either expressly promised, or, from the nature of the case, must have been understood to have tacitly promised, that they would conform to any decision taken either by the majority of the group or by those to whom authority had been committed. 16. Hence, not only Carads, but others who assert that expediency is the mother of justice and of right, are not speaking the truth, if what we say is correct. For the mother of natural law is human nature, which, even if we were not in any need, would still lead us to desire social companionship. And the human nature lead us to desire social companionship. And the mother of civil law is that bond of consent which derives its force from natural law, so that nature may be called the grandmother, as it were, of civil law. However, expediency does enter into natural law, for the author of nature, with a capital A, of nature, willed that we as individuals should be weak and in need of many things to live properly, the lack of which would drive us to seek society. expediency supplied to, with two O's, expediency supplied to the occasion for the rise of civil law, for the formation of groups of which we spoke, and the submission to authority took place first for some reason of expediency. The submission to authority took place for some reason of expediency. Moreover, those who prescribe laws for others usually have, or ought to have, some purpose of expediency in view. 17. Now, just as there are laws in each state that aim at securing some advantage for that state, so between all or most states some laws could be, and indeed have been established by common consent, which look to the advantage not of single communities, but of the whole great concourse of states. And this is the law we call the law of nations, whenever we distinguish it from natural law. 18. Carneades is wrong, too, when he slanders justice by calling it folly, for he admits himself that the citizen who obeys the civil law of his country is not a fool, even though in his respect for the law he may have to forego some advantage to himself. In the same way, it is not a foolish people that refrains from pushing its own advantage to the point of disregarding the laws common to all nations. The reason is the same in both instances, for just as a citizen who violates the civil law for the sake of a monetary advantage destroys thereby that which safeguards the lasting advantage of himself and his posterity. So a nation that transgresses the laws of nature and the nation and of nations breaks down the bulwarks that guard its own future peace. Even if no advantage were to be expected from keeping the law, it would be wise and not foolish to follow the direction in which we feel our nature leads us. 19. Wherefore, the saying is not universally true that we must admit it was the fear of wrong that caused the making of laws, which someone in Plato explains as meaning that men devised laws for fear of suffering injury, and so were driven by a kind of force to cultivate justice. That theory applies only to such institutions and laws as have been established to facilitate the execution of justice. Thus, many a multitude of persons, individually weak, have combined to set up and maintain, by their common strength, judicial courts to protect them from oppression by the powerful, in order that together they might control those for whom singly they were no match. In this sense, we may even accept without difficulty the saying that law is whatever satisfies the stronger, understanding by it that law cannot achieve its external aim unless it has force to back it. Enforcement. Thus, Solon accomplished great things, as he said, by harnessing force and law together. 20. Law, however, even lacking the support of force, is not entirely without influence. For justice brings peace of conscience, and injustice torment and anguish, such as Plato describes as inhabiting the breasts of tyrants. Good men unite in praising justice and condemning injustice. Most important of all, God is a foe to injustice. And that's why we love him. One of the reasons. A protector of justice. And though he I hereby reserve all my rights. And though he reserves his judgments for the next life, yet he often makes their power evident in this, as history teaches by manifold examples. 21. There are many who demand of private citizens a respect for justice, but who consider it unnecessary for a nation or the ruler of a nation. The reason for their error is, first of all, that they regard nothing in law but the advantage to be derived from it, which is obvious in the case of citizens who are too weak singly to defend themselves. But great states, which seem to contain within themselves everything required for the adequate maintenance of life, do not, apparently, stand in need of that virtue which looks to something outside itself, and is called justice. 22. But not to repeat what I have already said about law not being based on expediency alone, there is no state so strong that it may not sometime need the help of others outside itself, either for purposes of trade or to defend itself against the combined hosts of a number of other nations joined against it. Accordingly, we see the most powerful nations and kings working to obtain allies, whose value is not perceived by those who would shut law up within the boundaries of each state. Most true it is that everything becomes uncertain once men forsake the law. 23. If no community can subsist without law, as Aristotle showed by his famous illustration of brigand bands, surely the community that embraces the whole human race, or at least a great many nations, needs law. 25. There are persons who imagine that all laws lose their authority in wartime, but such a theory we should never accept. Rather, we should declare it wrong to begin a war, except for the enforcement of justice, and wrong to continue a war already begun, unless it is kept within the bounds of justice and good faith. Demosthenes well said that war should be made only against those who cannot be restrained by courts of law. For legal judgments are effective against persons who know they are too weak to resist, and wars are our resort against those who are strong enough or who think they are. Nonetheless, in order to be right, wars must be conducted as scrupulously as judicial proceedings habitually are. 26. Laws may be silenced by the clash of arms, but only those laws of the state that have to do with courts and peacetime affairs, not those other laws that are permanent and applicable at all times. As Dio of Perusa very well said, between enemies, written laws, that is, laws of particular states, have no validity. But unwritten laws, that is, those which nature dictates or which the nations have agreed to recognize, are still valid. 27. Writers of history furnish many instances that show how great is the power in warfare of the consciousness of a just cause. They often attribute the victory chiefly to that influence. Hence the proverbs that a soldier's strength is increased or destroyed by his cause, that seldom does a man come back unhurt who has gone to an unjust fight, that hope is one's comrade in a good cause, and others of similar tenor. Nor should the success of wicked enterprises make anyone dismayed. It is enough that the justice of a cause brings with it strength, great strength for action, even though, as often happens in human affairs, that strength is prevented by other opposing forces, from having its full effect, and for winning the friendships which nations as well as individuals need for many reasons. It is a vast help to have a reputation for making war neither recklessly nor unjustly, and for fighting it honorably, since no one readily allies himself with persons who, he believes, treat justice, uprightness, and good faith as things of little account. 28. Inasmuch, therefore, as I am convinced on the grounds I have now given, that there is a common law between nations which is valid for war and in war, there are many grave reasons why I should undertake to write on the subject. Throughout the Christian world I have seen a lawlessness in warfare that even barbarian races would think shameful. On trifling pretexts, or none at all, men rush to arms, and when once arms are taken up, all respect for law, whether human or divine, is lost, as though by some edict a fury had been let loose to commit every crime. 29. Confronted by his hideous spectacle, many of our best men have concluded that all armed conflicts must be forbidden to Christians, whose chief duty it is to love everyone. Their view seems now to have been accepted by John Wilde and by my fellow countryman Erasmus, both devoted lovers of ecclesiastical and civil peace. They have, I think, the same idea as we have. When to straighten something that has gone too far in one direction, we bend it back the opposite way. But their very effort to force a thing back too far toward the other extreme frequently does more harm than good, because the exaggeration in it is easily detected and detracts from the influence of what else they say that is actually true. Police. A remedy must therefore be found for both sets of extremists, that men may neither suppose that nothing in the way of war is lawful, nor that everything is. 30. At the same time, I have been anxious to contribute by my personal efforts something to the study of jurisprudence, which in former days I practiced in public office, with all the honesty of which I was capable. For this now is all the occupation left me, undeservedly exiled from the country to which my many labors had brought distinction. Many men before now have set out to give an orderly presentation of the subject. No one has succeeded, nor indeed could anyone succeed until a point hitherto too much neglected, the provisions that belong to positive law, were strictly separated from those of natural law. For natural laws are forever the same, and hence can be easily assembled into a system. But the provisions of positive law are constantly changing and differ from place to place, and so lie outside the scope of a systematic treatment, as do other notions of particular things. 31. But if the apostles of true justice would agree to treat only the various parts of natural, unchanging jurisprudence, omitting all that has its source in man's untrampled will, and if one would write of laws, another of taxes, another of judge's office, another of the interaction of intent, another of the establishing of facts, when all these parts were collected, there might then be created a body of jurisprudence. 32. The method which we believe should be followed, we have plainly indicated. The method which we believe should be followed, we have plainly indicated, by deeds rather than by words, in this present work, which comprises by far the noblest part of jurisprudence. 33. We have opened the first book by speaking of the origins of law, and have then examined the general question whether there is such a thing as a lawful war. Next, in order to make clear the difference between public and private war, we found we must explain the nature of sovereignty. What nations and what kings possess full sovereignty? Who possess it only in part? Who with the right of alienation? And who in other ways? Then we had to describe the duty of subjects to their superiors. The duty of subjects to the superiors. 34. In the second book, we undertook to discuss all the questions out of which a war may arise, and explained at length what kinds of property are held in common, what in private ownership, what rights persons may have over other persons, what are the obligations of ownership, what is the rule governing royal succession, what right is established by a pledge or a contract, what force a treaty or a public or a private oath has, and how it is to be interpreted, what reparation is due for damage inflicted, what is the sanctity of ambassadors, what is the law for burial of the dead, and what the proper nature of punishment. 35. The third book has for its subject, first, what is legitimate in war. After distinguishing what may be done with impunity, and what foreign nations assert is lawful from that which is really free of wrong, we proceed to consider the kinds of peace and all agreements relating to war. 36. The value of the work seems to me greater because I have said no man so far has treated this subject as a whole, and those who have handled parts of it have done it in such a way as to leave much for others to labor over. Nothing has survived from the ancient philosophers on the topic, either from the Greeks, although Aristotle did write a book called Rights of War, or from those who allegiance was given to the youthful Christianity, though such a book from them would have been extremely precious. Of the old Roman books relative to the law of war and treaties, nothing has come down to us but the titles. Those who make collections of cases they call cases of conscience merely put together chapters on war, on promises, on oaths, on reprisals, along with other topics, in brackets 37-38. Faults of treaties by earlier writers, example Victoria, Henry of Gorcum, Ayala, Gentile, bracket 39. I have now to explain briefly what helps I have used and with what care I have approached the task. In the first place, I have taken pains to refer for proofs of all my statements regarding the law of nature to certain ideas so unquestionably true that no one can deny them without doing violence to himself. For the principles of that law, if only you look at them fairly, are in themselves plain and evident, almost as clear as the things we perceive with our external senses. 40. Further, to prove the existence of this law of nature, I have called on the testimonies of philosophers, historians, poets, and lastly, orators. Not that we should believe these men indiscriminately, for they were accustomed to serving the interests of their sect, their argument or their cause. But whenever many of them at different times and in different places declared the same thing to be true, their anonymity must be ascribed to a universal cause, which, as we inquire into it, can be nothing else than a correct inference from the principles of nature, or some general consensus of opinion. The former means a law of nature, the latter a law of nations. The difference between these two kinds of law cannot be found in the testimonies just mentioned, for writers are apt to confuse the terms law of nature and law of nations. But from the character of the content, a rule that cannot be deduced from fixed principles by a sure process of reasoning, and that is yet apparently everywhere observed, must have originated in the free will of mankind. 41. So I have endeavored always to differentiate particularly between these two kinds of law, no less than between them and civil law. Also, in considering the law of nature, I have distinguished between what really and on every occasion is the law, and what merely produces an external effect resembling that of the original law, such as a prohibition against violent resistance, or an order for general defense by public force when it is to someone's advantage, or when it prevents some serious trouble to issue it. How necessary in many cases is it to draw the distinction will become apparent in the course of this work. 36 minutes, wow. God bless you all if you're still here. This is important stuff. 42. Among philosophers, Aristotle deservedly holds the first place, whether you take into account his order of treating his material, the acuteness of his distinctions, or the solitude of his reasoning. Would that this preeminence had not for some centuries past degenerated into such a tyranny that the truth, which Aristotle labored so faithfully to serve, is now more suppressed by Aristotle's name than by any other influence. For myself, here as well as elsewhere, I practice the liberty of the ancient Christians, who swore allegiance to no philosopher's school, not because they agreed with those who said all knowledge was impossible, the most foolish view of all, but because they thought that no school had seen all the truth, and not one but had seen some bit of it. Accordingly, they believed that to gather into a whole the truth scattered among the several philosophers and diffused through the sects would surely be to establish a way of teaching that was truly Christian. 44. Criticism of Aristotle's theory of ethics. 45. We propose to treat Aristotle with great respect, but with the same liberty that he, in his zeal for truth, allowed himself in dealing with his own teachers. 46. History has a double value as regards our subjects, for it provides both examples and judgments. The nobler the times and the people, the more weight their examples carry. For that reason we have preferred the ancient examples, Greek and Roman, to any other, nor should the judgments of history be despised, especially when they agree, for the law of nature, as we have said, is proved thereby in a way. As the law of nations, there is no other proof. 47. The sentiments of poets and orators do not carry so much weight. We cite them often, but less as a basis for faith than as a means of adding some beauty from their lines to what we are trying to say. 48. I frequently appeal to the authority of the books written or approved by men under inspiration of God, but draw a distinction between the Old Testament and the New. There are those who maintain that the Old Testament represents the law of nature, but unquestionably they are wrong, for many of its precepts are expressions of God's free will, which, however, never does violence to true natural law. So, up to a point, the Old Testament may be cited as a source of natural law, provided we distinguish correctly between a law of God, which on occasion he executes through men, and a law made by men for one another. 50. The New Testament I use in order to find something I cannot learn anywhere else, namely, what is permissible for Christians. Contrary to the practice of many men, I distinguish this from the law of nature, convinced as I am that this most holy law requires a greater holiness on our part than the law of nature alone demands. Nor have I failed to note the things we are advised to do, and not commanded, that we may realize that there are both commands to which disobedience is wicked and liable to punishment, and an exalted good to which a noble mind will aspire and not lack its reward. 51 and 55. Description of legal and doctrinal authorities and texts cited in this book, canon law, writings of church fathers and medieval schoolmen, Roman law, and commentaries on it, etc. 56. Throughout this work, I have aimed at three things above all: to make the reasons for my conclusions as clear as possible, to set in a definite order the material I had to treat, and to distinguish plainly between things that might seem to be the same and were not. 57. I have refrained from taking up topics that belong to another treatise, such as showing what course of action is practically advantageous, for those matters have their own special science, which is politics. Aristotle rightly treats it alone, without admixture of anything else. With Bodin, on the other hand, that science is mixed with the science of law, which is our subject. In some passages I have indeed touched on the question of expediency, but only in passing, and in order to distinguish it clearly from the question of what is lawful. 58. If anyone supposes I have written with an eye to any of the controversies of our own age, either some that have already arisen, or some that may be foreseen as likely to arise in the future, he does me an injustice. For I truthfully declare that, even as mathematicians view their figures abstracted from bodies, so I, in my treatment of law, have held my mind aloof from all particular events. 59 and 60. Aim at consciousness, aim at consciousness of exposition, use of direct quotations from the classics. 61. I ask and adjure all those into whose hands this book will come to use the same liberty with me that I have assumed for myself in judging the opinions and writings of other men. They will not be quicker in advising me of error than I shall be in following their advice. And now, if I have here said anything at variance with piety, with good morals, with Holy Scripture, with the consensus of the Christian Church, with any phase of truth, let it be unsaid. So 44 minutes it took me to read 16 pages. But and then I guess now that I've read the Bible, I see that different chapters are different books, but they call this book 1 because everything follows the Bible, like I'm going to keep telling you. Book 1. What is war? What is law? Yes, a whole lot there that I'm just gonna let be. Thank you all for joining. think we need to read more. I mean, we have rights, and if we don't know what they are, then we actually don't. And yes, we can do and have more. We're just being told what to do, and not incompetently, without capacity. We're being ordered around. Slave, incompetent ward of state. Is there a difference between those things? Maybe. Maybe. God bless you all. Need help? Give thanks.